We
Yeah,
got
I said that.
we got Juice and KK and Rubes.
Okay, sit here.
Hello world and welcome to our first class of our Bible series. You're watching Homeschooling Scientists. I got here with me my three kiddos. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yep.
Catherine.
And Char just came over here.
And Char, our cat,
He's
just
off the
came
screen, sadly.
up. Okay. How about kids? I said kids, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Introduce Char.
So like Juice, do you want to, should we just call you Juice? No, we're going to call you Juice. So we have Jules.
Ruby.
And Ruby. Okay.
And Char.
And
Who is
Char,
our cat. Not
yes,
a child.
he will maybe come over here.
Charmander? Me.
Okay, so for our Bible class, I'm not really using like a book or we're using a book. We're using a Bible. That's our book for this class. So I'm not really using like a specific curriculum or anything like that. This is just going to be kind of things that I've put together and yeah, it's just kind of like a little Bible study thing. But we are going to be doing a survey of the New Testament is our goal for this class for this year. Okay. So when we say survey of the New Testament, well, you guys know what the New Testament is. Like survey is kind of like a sort of short overview. So we're going to go kind of book by book through the New Testament and give an overview of that book, kind of tell what it's all about, give a few, if there's like any like really important or really big things that sort of stick out, like specific passages, but we're not going to necessarily be going like verse by verse and everything. So we will have the kids, I will be having the kids do reading as part of this class, but obviously that won't come through on the video. So just know as you're setting up your homeschooling classroom, that is something that we do. I recommend it for all of you as well. But it's not not something that we're going to show to all of you, because just a video of us sitting around reading would probably be pretty boring. But we'll share with you like the discussion sections that we have. So, yeah. Okay. So we're going to start off, obviously, with a survey of the New Testament. What are the first books of the New Testament? Do you guys know? Do you remember?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah, the four Gospels, right? You heard that name for them before, the Gospels? Yeah? Okay. So the Gospels, as we do this like survey of the New Testament, we're probably going to spend extra time on these, and I am just going to deal with them as sort of the Gospels as a whole. We're going to kind of put them together to talk about them. So talk about all four at once, because they all four sort of talk about the same type of thing.
Different accounts of the same story.
Different accounts of the same story. Yeah. So we're going to kind of put them together because of that. And we'll talk about what's similar and what's different between the books and stuff like that. And we'll do some like zooming in on specific passages and specific parts of the Gospels also as we go through this. I figure it's a good thing to spend a little extra time on anyway, because, it's like if you had to pick what's the most important book of the Bible, or, like what's the most important part? I mean, I think you'd probably have to pick the Gospels, right? Because they're what tell us about Jesus and, everything that happened, is his crucifixion and death, life, resurrection, all that stuff. And all of that, which is so important to our salvation. So, if you have to pick like what's the most important books of the Bible, the Gospels would definitely be up there, right? So talking about them generally, what are the Gospels? I mean, you said they're different accounts of the same story, but like accounts from who? Do you know?
His disciples.
Yeah, Jesus' disciples and like the apostles, right? So not all of them were written by apostles. Do you know? So 2 of them were kind of written by apostles, and 2 of them were written by like other disciples that sort of knew the apostles. Do you know which ones?
Is one of them Luke?
One of Luke for which one? That was written by an apostle or a friend of the apostles?
A friend.
Yeah, so Luke was one of the ones that was written by like a friend of the apostles, essentially. So he was a disciple of Jesus, but he wasn't one of like the 12 apostles that like worked really closely with Jesus. But he like knew the apostles and traveled with them and worked with them, right?
Is the other one Mark?
For friend, yes. Yeah, so the other one would be Mark. So that was written by, just to distinguish, so there's like John Mark is usually, is often what he's called. So John Mark was the one who wrote Mark. And once again, he was sort of like a friend, an associate of Paul and like the apostles and stuff, and he knew them, but he wasn't, sort of like a direct account of Jesus. So that leaves the other 2 then. So Matthew and John, which were written by one of the 12, right? So Matthew and John, the writers of the books Matthew and John, right? Those were the people who, since the beginning of Jesus' ministry, since he called them to come and follow him, they walked with him, they lived with him, day in and day out. They watched him everything that he did. Each day they ate with him, they fished with him, they, whatever. And then eventually, watched and died, and that they were there and were eyewitnesses to the miracles that he did. They were eyewitnesses of his death. They were eyewitnesses of him being resurrected, right? So I think that's important to point out because, I think a lot of people, especially like non-Christians, it's like when they talk about the Bible, it's kind of like, oh, it's just like stories, right? It's stories that somebody's telling. It's like good stories, or it's stuff that somebody made up or whatever. Or it was written by people who didn't really know, weren't really there, right? So I think it's important to point out that the Gospels, when you're reading Matthew and John, when you're reading those books, you're reading the eyewitness account from someone who was there, right? This would be like if you wrote a book about me, right? Because like you're my kid, so like we live together, we do everything together, just about most things, and so like every part of my life pretty much. So it's like you writing a book about me, right? And so if I were somehow to go out and start doing miracles and everything, you would be one of the most reliable people to tell that story, right? Because if you were there, if I was out doing miracles and stuff, and you saw all that, you would be the one that we'd want to listen to, because you got to see it, and you knew me really close and all that stuff. And that's what we have in the books of Matthew and John, is two people who were with Jesus, walked with him, lived with him, watched all his miracles, and then, at the end of that ministry, sat down and basically wrote a book about it to tell other people, so that it could be recorded for all of history, and that here now, even 2,000 years later, here we are reading what they wrote, right? Now then, in Mark and Luke, they are people who, again, were eyewitnesses to a lot of stuff. They saw, like Paul's things that Paul did, miracles from the apostles and all that stuff, but they weren't necessarily, the 12 apostles, one of the 12. And probably, so like this is another thing that I think sometimes people forget, is like we think of Jesus's, like, the 12 apostles, and they were sort of like Jesus's close friends, and sort of like knew and walked with him and lived with him. But it wasn't like they were his only disciples, right? He had other people that were his disciples that he taught, that followed him. And as we'll get into, and as we get through the Gospels, even in the thousands, and that these people were, even they were still, witnesses to his teachings and miracles and things like that, right? And so Mark and Luke sort of take the role of, instead of, it's kind of like, instead of, if we didn't, Ruby, if you were going to write a book about me, like that would be kind of like the best person that we want to talk to, right? But kind of like the next best thing is if we had someone who was going to write a book, and let's say they wanted to write a book about me, and they came and talked to you, and they talked to you, and they talked to you, and they talked to everybody that knew me, and all the witnesses, and then learned everything they could from you guys, and then wrote that down. And that's kind of, what Mark and Luke do, right? So, and again, they to emphasize that it's not like they didn't know any of these things themselves. They also were witness to many miracles and things like that, but just not to the same extent that, like, Matthew was as one of the 12 that was in Jesus's inner circle, right? So all that to say, these are people who knew Jesus, who experienced these things, and then wrote them down for our benefit, right? So these are not just made up stories or whatever, as some people want to make them out to be. So you have to ask the question, if Ruby is an eyewitness, and let's say I was out doing miracles, and you wrote a book saying my daddy's out doing miracles and things like that, you have to ask the question, like, is this a reliable eyewitness? And, is she lying, or is she telling the truth, right? And that's kind of the question that people today have to ask, because, we can't go back in time and talk to Mark or Matthew or whatever, but we can read the things that they wrote and say, okay, they tell us all these crazy things about Jesus and miracles and all these weird things that happened. Um, are they reliable eyewitnesses? And as we'll get into later, there's lots of reasons to think they were.
If there's 4 different accounts and 4 different 2 who knew Jesus and 2 who knew people who knew Jesus, then there should be a good reason that, and they're all the same, just about, then it should be true.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I think, that's one of the questions you can ask is like, why do we have 4 books that tell the same story in the Bible? Why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And I think it's for that reason, right? That we can, that's not to say that, if you read, like the book of like First John or some other random book in the Bible where it's only one thing talking about it. It's not to say that that's less reliable, but I think it just shows the importance of it because again, everything in Christianity, everything in our faith revolves around Jesus, what he did, who he was, the miracles he did, him dying for our sins, right? And if none of that really happened, if Jesus didn't die for our sins, if he didn't do miracles and all of that stuff, if he wasn't really the Son of God, then our whole faith and everything just collapses, right? It would be pointless. So I think that's why we have 4 Gospels, because it's like, because this is such an important part. So like in other books that we'll get into in the New Testament, it talks about things like, well, here's how to set up a church, and here's how you pick deacons and pastors and whatever, and here's the requirement for your pastors and stuff like that. And that's important, right? We should follow that, but it's nowhere near as important to us as the story of Jesus and him dying for our sins and all that. So like if we didn't follow, or if we didn't know or didn't follow or whatever, or if it was somehow there was some question about this whole thing with like the requirements for pastors or whatever, like that's a relatively minor thing, right? It doesn't, if that's wrong, you can still have churches, you're still Christians and so on and so forth. But if everything written in the Gospels is wrong, then again, that's like you don't have Christianity anymore. So I think that's why we have 4, and just so that we can be really, really 100% sure this is what happened. Here's different eyewitnesses accounts of it. And just to show like, yeah, this is really 100% reliable and you can trust it with your life, kind of thing, because it is that important. Okay, so we talked about 4 different Gospels. They each provide a different perspective. One other thing I wanted to see, do you guys know when they were written? So they were written, it's one of those things, it kind of depends on who you ask. Nobody's like really 100% sure, but just based on some of the things that are referred to in the Gospels, and like persecution of Christians and things like that, they think they were probably written, the sort of generally accepted answer is between 70 and 100 AD, which I think it probably was before that, especially in the case of like, I think Mark is usually considered one of the earlier ones. I think it probably was before that, and there's, I think I've read some people who propose even 60 or 50 AD for some of the Gospels to be written. So it's, it's debated, but the point being that whenever it was written, you're reading something that was written by an eyewitness. And I know, like, some people will ask the question, well, why weren't they written down immediately? And it's like, well, you got to remember, these were especially in the case of Matthew and Matthew and John, these were the apostles. They were sent out. What were they doing after Jesus died? Teaching others, yeah. They were doing missionary work and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't until, in my mind, it's like it wasn't until later in life that they would have really had the time to sit and write a book anyway. But it's also, not the kind of thing that you forget, right? Like if somebody was out here doing miracles, like, you're not going to forget that. But so anyway, I bring that up because, like, that's something that people will say is like, well, can we really trust it when they were written, decades after the events happened? And it's like, well, I think that, again, there's good reason why they were written later, because the people doing it were so focused on establishing churches and essentially being evangelists and missionaries and all of that stuff. But also that, it's like, you're not going to forget that. Especially something that dramatic, right? Okay. I think the last thing that I'll say, just for kind of this, like, introductory lesson. So we talked about how these are 4 different accounts of the same story. And as part of that, each of them sort of has some things that's not in the other books, right? So there's some things that Mark talks about that isn't talked about in the others.
Probably another reason why they wrote 4 Gospels.
Yeah. Now, there are also things, like, especially, like, the really important things, like, obviously, like, Jesus' death and stuff, like, all of them talk about that, right? But there's also, like, either different miracles or whatever that some people talk about that others don't, right? Is that, and so you kind of want to ask the question, like, is that bad? Is it wrong? Did they get it? Did they mess up? Did they get it wrong? What do we do with this fact that some of them wrote about different things? Why did one of them write about something and the others didn't? Is that good or is that bad?
In some ways, it's good, because then you get to, like, hear about more kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. You get to hear about more different types of things that happen. Yep.
Different things would have stuck out to different people.
Yeah, different things stick out to different people. Yeah.
Maybe they were gone for whatever reason.
Okay, maybe they didn't see something. Okay. So another, to your first point, another thing that I think about is, and I want to say, is it the end of John? I want to say it's John that he basically makes this statement. He's like, there were so many things that Jesus did that, if you were to try to record all of them, you would, fill all the, or am I thinking of Acts?
Oh, right here. And there are so many other things which Jesus did, which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written.
Yeah. Man, I need my glasses. My eyes have gotten so bad lately. Thank you, Ruby. I usually do my read Bible and stuff, and I just use my phone these days. And so, like, going back to my physical Bible, it's like, oh boy, just how much difference my eyes have had. Anyway.
The print is also so small.
Well, yeah, but I used to have no problem reading it. Joys of getting old. What the point I was trying to make with that is that, you know, when you're reading the Bible, and again, you're reading eyewitness accounts, they're not necessarily, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're not necessarily trying to tell us every little thing that Jesus ever did, right? They're trying to tell us the important parts. And so, you know, so obviously we get the story of his death, resurrection on the cross, and all of that. And then they also tell us enough of his life and enough of the miracles and stuff that, you know, sort of like extra evidence, if you will. It's like, oh, I also saw this thing. I also saw this thing. But as, you know, John says at the end of his book, it's like if they tried to write every little thing that Jesus did, you know, it would just be, you just couldn't do it, because it's like there are so many miracles and everything that they saw Jesus do that it's like it's almost like there's so much stuff that we couldn't even write it all down. It would be so hard.
It'd be a library.
It'd be a library full of stuff if you wrote everything that Jesus did. So they're trying to just give us enough, because the whole point is for us, you know, 2,000 years later, to know the truth. You know, it's like giving us enough that we know that we can have faith, that we can trust in Jesus, that we can trust the word of the apostles, and, you know, everything in the Bible, right? So it's enough for us to know what we need to know, but it's not everything that Jesus did, because that would be, yeah, a library, basically. Does that kind of make sense? One other thing I'll touch on, just because we kind of, you know, we with our summer lecture, we did logic, our logic and reasoning class. We talked about contradictions, right? So one of the things that people will talk about is say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John contradict each other in some of the stories that they tell. What is a contradiction? You remember?
Like you say something and you say something else that, like, one thing can't be true and not be true at the same time.
Yeah, so another way to put that is like two things that can't be true at the same time.
This
right?
Bible is pink. This Bible is blue.
Right.
Or it could be pink and blue, but you have to say it's all pink and it's all blue.
Right. So, yeah. So if you have two things that can't both be true at the same time, then that's a contradiction, right? So like one of the things that people will look at in the Bible, and again, you've got 4 different people talking about Jesus' life and stuff, and focusing on different aspects of it. And each of them is not necessarily trying to give a complete picture. And so people will look at that and say, well, like when Matthew or Mark talks about different things, they'll look at that and say that's a contradiction, right? Or if they give slightly different accounts of the same event, they'll look at that and say, oh, that's a contradiction. And there's a lot of these we can get into. We might pick a few to look at, just as a fun little exercise. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I think you can kind of roughly summarize it. I mean, there's like people, you can go online and people make these lists that's like 100 contradictions in the Gospels or whatever. And I've sat, back when I was younger, I've sat and gone through those lists and looked through, each and every one of them. So like, is this a contradiction? Is it not? How do we explain it? So on and so forth. Because as Christians, we don't think there's contradictions in the Bible, that it's given by inspiration of God, that it's trustworthy, and that it doesn't contradict itself. And so you can sit through and you can go through these lists, and oftentimes that's kind of there are a few that you kind of have to dig a little bit to understand what's going on. But I would say for like 80 to 90% of the things that, supposed contradictions in the Bible, you just look at it and say, it's just not a contradiction. It's like saying, Ruby went to church. If I talked about Ruby went to church last Sunday, and Catherine talked about Ruby was at church the Sunday before that, and they look at it and say, well, she said he was at church 2 weeks ago, and you're saying she was at church last week. That's a contradiction. It's like, no, it's not a contradiction.
Because they could have gone the week before and that week.
Yeah. So like you could have done the same thing twice, right? That happens a lot in life. And I understand that I'm kind of simplifying, but for a lot of those contradictions, oftentimes that's what it comes down to. Or at least the things that people say are contradictions in the Bible. All right, feels like we talked about a lot. So that's going to be enough for us today. You've been watching The Homeschooling Scientist. We're going to wrap this up, get some dinner, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Subscribe.
Hey, Char.